And I did. Heaven knows I did. So if you've ever walked a path you promised yourself you'd avoid, if you've ever needed validation more than you feared criticism, if you've ever found yourself caught between what's right and what feels necessary, then perhaps you'll relate to my journey. And if you can't, I understand. This is my truth. Authentic, vulnerable, unvarnished. And I'm prepared to share everything. So keep watching, because what unfolded next transformed my entire world. Subscribe to Heartfelt Tales Unfold, where hidden truths emerge from shadows and certain realities are too powerful to remain concealed. I'm 42 years old. For 7 years, I've shared a home with a man who rarely acknowledges my presence. We don't argue. We don't share joy. We simply exist in parallel. He returns home late, perpetually occupied, perpetually exhausted. His phone captures his attention before I ever could. I've abandoned waiting for him, stopped inquiring about his work, stopped hoping he'd recognize when I refreshed the bedding or transformed my appearance. When I cut 10 inches from my hair, he showed no reaction whatsoever. No surprise, no acknowledgement. I might be anyone. I might be invisible. Some evenings, I believe that's precisely what I've become. Our home is stunning, spacious, contemporary, immaculate. Everything precisely arranged except our relationship. We've furnished every space with beautiful pieces, yet there's no tenderness, no spontaneity, no vitality. Just pristine granite surfaces and tastefully displayed photographs of a connection that once radiated brightness, now dulled to monotone. Then David arrived, my husband's son from his first marriage, 22 years old. He relocated here temporarily, explaining he needed to build savings and concentrate on his education. I welcomed the arrangement. He demonstrated courtesy, maintained a quiet demeanor, offered assistance. He typically stayed independent, yet he perceived details others missed. He inquired about my experiences. He appreciated my culinary efforts. He mentioned the fragrance I chose evoked vanilla and peaceful weekend mornings. My husband hadn't acknowledged my perfume in countless years, hadn't disconnected from his devices long enough to even notice it. But David paid attention, and initially it wasn't inappropriate. Not at the beginning. It felt simply human, like illumination entering a space that had grown dim. I discovered myself selecting that fragrance more frequently, applying lip balm before walking past his doorway, expressing amusement more openly when he was nearby. I understood it was inappropriate to regard him differently. But nobody explains how you don't plunge immediately. You drift gradually, one glance, one exchange, one small, nearly imperceptible moment of connection at a time. And initially, it's not even attraction. It's acknowledgement. It's someone inquiring, how are you truly feeling? And genuinely waiting for your response. That's what affected me. Not his appearance, not his youth, not some elaborate daydream. It was that he truly saw me. He paid attention. He observed the way I exhaled when I settled down, asked whether my shoulders ached. My husband never asked about my discomfort. David did. And I wish I could claim I maintained boundaries, that I constantly reminded myself of his relationship to me, that I never entertained inappropriate thoughts. But honestly, when someone offers relief after prolonged suffering, you don't question its origin. You simply accept it. That's where it began. Not with physical contact, not with intimacy, simply with someone recognizing my existence, and me temporarily forgetting the role I was meant to fulfill. It occurred on a Sunday afternoon, one of those unhurried, peaceful days when the residence feels excessive, too still. I discovered an aged recipe card hidden in a cabinet. My mother's handwriting, edges worn with time. Her banana walnut loaf. She prepared it whenever someone required consolation. And perhaps I did. I gathered the components, individually, anticipating no interest. My husband occupied his customary position on the sofa, fixated on a display. I informed him about my baking plans. He didn't even glance upward, simply murmured, "I don't want any." He never does. I offered no response, just combined the ingredients, in silence, allowed the aroma of vanilla and cinnamon to permeate the kitchen. Then I detected footsteps. David entered without shoes, hair disheveled, carrying a partially read novel. He hesitated in the entrance, observed the mixing bowl, and smiled warmly. "That smells wonderful," he said. I shrugged dismissively. "It's just banana loaf." Still smells wonderful, he emphasized, approaching the island counter, settling onto a stool as though he'd done so countless times. He didn't request permission to assist. He simply retrieved a fresh kitchen towel and began preparing the baking tray. That modest action, so effortless, so unpretentious, awakened something within me I hadn't realized remained responsive. We navigated the kitchen like synchronized partners, as though we shared history there. I made a lighthearted remark, something playful about how my mother claimed the uncooked mixture always exceeded the finished product. He regarded me, eyebrows lifted. Want to sample it beforehand? I suggested playfully, extending the wooden spoon toward him. He paused momentarily, then grinned. That expression, half inquisitive, half entertained, as though uncertain whether I was teasing or challenging him. He leaned closer, tasted from the spoon's edge, and chuckled softly. She was correct, the batter's superior. I laughed as well. But internally, I froze because, for just an instant, as he returned the spoon, our fingertips made contact, and he looked at me. Not boldly or unsuitably, but with awareness. Too much awareness. His gaze remained on mine slightly longer than appropriate, not lengthy enough to define clearly, but sufficient to register emotionally. In that minuscule moment, barely exceeding a heartbeat, the atmosphere transformed. The kitchen, previously cold and familiar, suddenly felt warmer, denser, as though something had been left accessible or unlocked. I averted my gaze first, stirred the bowl again unnecessarily. He remained silent, just sat observing while I transferred the batter into the tray. It represented nothing, yet simultaneously it represented everything. Something passed between us, something unspoken, something gentle yet dangerous, like tension building, too delicate to identify, too genuine to dismiss. That evening I convinced myself it meant nothing, just a moment, a glance, an innocent interaction in a peaceful kitchen, but my thoughts refused to release it. I reclined in bed, eyes open, gazing at the ceiling while my husband slumbered beside me, his back turned as always, body curved toward the wall as though I didn't exist on my side of the mattress. I listened to the quietness, then to the faint glow of the corridor light, and beyond that, David's room, the gentle creak of floorboards, the occasional rustle of pages. He remained awake too. I wondered whether the moment affected him as it did me. I wondered whether he was attempting to dismiss it just as I was. I closed my eyes and instructed myself to stop, to abandon it. But my heart had already preserved it. That look, that fleeting warmth, the spoon, the brush of skin. I adjusted beneath the covers. But nothing about that bed offered comfort anymore. The following morning I lingered longer before the mirror. I didn't intend to, but I did. I brushed my hair slowly, applied lip balm twice, changed my top twice. Nothing excessive, nothing obvious, just different. Something that communicated, I still value myself. But I convinced myself I was being ridiculous. It's harmless. I simply wanted to feel like myself again. And perhaps that was accurate. Perhaps that's all I was seeking. But the truth, the deeper truth, I experienced something for the first time in years. Something intense, something vital, not desire, not fantasy, but presence. Like for a brief instant I returned to inhabiting my own body, returned to a physical form I hadn't recognized in ages, returned to a version of myself I believed had vanished. And it wasn't genuinely about David. It wasn't about him personally. It was about the version of myself I witnessed reflected in his perception. She appeared alive. She appeared warm. She appeared valued. That frightened me, because once you recognize her, once you comprehend, she's still present, still breathing beneath all the neglect and silence. You cannot return to pretending she's irrelevant. You cannot return to emotionless meals and hollow exchanges, to the sound of utensils striking dishes while your husband stares at a screen, to becoming background noise in your own existence. I kept telling myself I was overanalyzing, that I was simply isolated, that I was misinterpreting situations because I needed to experience something, anything. But the reality is, once your heart awakens even slightly, it doesn't return to dormancy. Not easily, and mine had just awakened. Following that Sunday, dynamics shifted, not dramatically, not with any significant announcement, but through small, nearly imperceptible increments. David began occupying more time in the kitchen. He never explained why, just wandered in while I was preparing meals, leaned against the counter, posed, questions he already knew responses to. He observed me navigate as though I deserved attention. And I didn't request he stop. He complimented my cooking, my jewelry, the shade of my blouse. Never forcefully or heavily, just observantly, as though he noticed details others overlooked, as though he desired to. And for someone who had grown accustomed to invisibility, that attention felt essential. We began conversing more, about literature, childhood experiences, random topics. I'd share a story and he'd listen, genuinely listen, eyes focused on mine. No phone, no distraction, just presence. And I laughed. Goodness, I hadn't laughed like that in so long. Not the polite chuckle I offered my husband habitually, but deep, authentic laughter that surprised even me. One evening, I was rinsing dishes, sleeves rolled upward, water warm against my skin. David stood beside me, drying the plates. We moved rhythmically, passing dishes, wiping, stacking. Then our hands made contact. It wasn't deliberate, but neither of us withdrew. We simply stood there momentarily, fingertips resting lightly, not enough to constitute a touch, but far too much to call accidental. I looked at him, he looked at me, and in that split second, the space felt electric, like the air between us was vibrating. But I didn't move, and neither did he. We simply continued drying dishes as though nothing had occurred. But everything had. Several days later, I baked the banana loaf again. Same recipe, same bowl, same aroma filling the air. I told myself it was merely a craving, that I wanted to feel connected to my mother. But deep within, I knew. I wanted to discover whether he'd remember. He entered as he always did, gentle smile, hands in his pockets. I glanced up from the bowl and said it again without consideration. Want to sample it? He paused, then stepped closer. Closer than previously. I held the spoon toward him, but this time I offered it to him directly. His lips touched the edge. His eyes remained on mine. It was nothing, and it was everything. My hand trembled slightly. I hoped he didn't notice, but he did. I recognized it in the way he swallowed. Slow, deliberate. And then the entrance door opened. Footsteps. My husband. David stepped back quickly, wiped his mouth, moved to the sink. I stood frozen, the spoon still gripped in my hand. My husband entered, briefcase in one hand, loosened tie draped around his neck. He looked at us, looked at the dessert, said nothing. But something in his expression shifted. It wasn't suspicion. Not precisely. It was more like recognition. As though something in him finally noticed something that had always existed there. Quiet, waiting. He kissed my cheek habitually, muttered something about exhaustion, and walked past us as though we were fixtures. But that moment, that breath of silence between his glance and his departure, that was the last evening anything between David and me could be considered innocent. The night it occurred, the sky erupted, rain like sharp points against the windows, wind howling through gaps in the house as though attempting to warn me. I remember how the thunder shook the structure, low, deep, like something ancient awakening. My husband was traveling, another conference, another hotel room. He barely acknowledged goodbye. Just a nod, a hurried zip of his luggage, and the sound of the entrance door closing behind him. The house felt more vacant than usual, too large, too hollow, like every room resonated with unspoken words. I poured myself tea, sat on the sofa, attempted to focus on a book I'd previously read. The words wouldn't register. The storm made everything feel raw. And then I heard it. A sound I wasn't anticipating. A cry, brief, sharp, from down the corridor. David. I didn't think. I simply moved, bare feet on cold tiles, heart racing harder than the thunder. His door was slightly ajar. I pushed it slowly. He was sitting upright, drenched in perspiration, breathing as though he couldn't capture his own breath, eyes wild, hands gripping the sheets. "David," I whispered. He didn't respond, just looked at me as though he didn't know his location or identity, as though whatever he witnessed in that dream still gripped his throat. I crossed the room, sat on the edge of his bed, touched his arm. He flinched, then grabbed me. Not forcefully, not roughly, just desperately, as though I was the only tangible thing in the room. I wrapped my arms around him, held him the way I used to embrace my son when he was young and frightened. But David wasn't a child. He was a man. And this moment wasn't safe. He buried his face in my neck. His breath was warm, unsteady. His fingers gripped the back of my robe, and I didn't withdraw. I should have. Heaven help me, I should have, but I didn't. I told myself it was merely comfort. Just a moment. But the moment extended, and then my robe shifted, only slightly, barely noticeable. But his fingers lingered, not accidentally, not from confusion. They remained. He pulled back just enough to look at me. His eyes searched mine. He wasn't crying anymore. He was just looking, seeing me. And I kissed him. He didn't lean in. I did. My mouth met his as though it had been waiting, as though it knew. It lasted only seconds, but it shattered everything. We pulled back rapidly, as though the air burned. Breathless, eyes wide, hands trembling. He whispered my name, barely audible, and I couldn't speak. The shame arrived fast like a wave, hot, ugly, all-consuming. I stood too quickly, nearly fell, didn't look back. I ran down the corridor like someone fleeing, closed my door, locked it, pressed my back against the wood as though attempting to contain something inside or keep something outside. And then I looked in the mirror, and I saw her. The woman I swore I'd never become, the woman who crossed the boundary. Her lips were still parted, her eyes wide with disbelief, and all I could think was, who am I now? Because I didn't recognize her, not at all. The following morning the house was quieter than usual, not just quiet but tense, as though even the walls didn't know what to express. I prepared coffee with shaking hands, stared too long at the steam rising from the pot, hoping it would clarify something within me. David didn't come to the kitchen, didn't pass through the hallway, didn't speak. When I finally saw him, just for a second, he was by the stairs, backpack slung over one shoulder, keys in his hand. Our eyes almost met, but he looked past me, said, "I'm heading out," like it was any other day, and then he departed. I stood there in the middle of the kitchen holding a mug I didn't remember filling, and everything just slowed. The guilt sat heavy on my chest, not because of what we did, but because of what we both now carried. Silently, alone. My husband returned that evening, suitcase by the door, the smell of stale travel air clinging to his jacket. He embraced me as he always did, one arm, brief, distracted, asked if dinner was ready before even removing his shoes. I nodded, said almost, but my mind was elsewhere. Still in that room, still experiencing the moment I never should have allowed. I burned the rice, forgot the salt, spilled the wine. He didn't notice. Or perhaps he did, but he didn't say a word. Just sat in his chair, scrolled through his phone, ate what he could, left the rest. And somehow that silence hurt more than any argument ever could. David remained in the house for another 2 weeks. We barely crossed paths. When we did, it was brief, polite, distant. He didn't come to the kitchen as frequently, didn't sit by the counter, didn't offer to help. And I didn't bake, not once. I avoided mirrors, avoided my own thoughts. But guilt has a way of discovering you. In the clink of a fork, in the creak of a door, in the middle of the night when you're staring at the ceiling. And he's just down the hallway. Then one morning he informed us he was relocating. Said he needed space. Said the commute to campus was becoming too challenging. Said he wanted to focus more on school. My husband just shrugged, didn't even glance up from his laptop. Young men need independence, he said, as though it was nothing, as though David hadn't been living under our roof, eating at our table, sharing the air that now felt too constricted to breathe. But I knew the truth. Something had fractured. And it wasn't just between me and David. It was the final thread of illusion, the deception I'd been clinging to for years. I didn't lose my marriage that night. I lost the illusion that I was still in it, that it could be revived, that he saw me, needed me, loved me. The truth was that version of us had perished long before the kiss. The only difference now, I could finally see the remains. I started journaling 2 nights after David left. I didn't plan to. I just needed somewhere to place the weight, someplace private. Someplace that wouldn't look back at me with judgment. At first I wrote about the weather, about what I cooked, about errands. But the pages didn't care for small talk, and neither did I. Eventually the pen started writing what I'd been afraid to say aloud. Was it emotional starvation or emotional weakness? Had I spent so long being untouched that I mistook kindness for desire? Did I develop feelings for David because he saw me, or because I stopped seeing myself? And the harder question, would I have done the same if it had been someone else? If it weren't David, if it were a stranger, a colleague, an old flame, would I have still felt that pull? Or was it something about him specifically? The timing, the proximity, the quiet way he made space for me in a world that had stopped making any. Sometimes I think I was pushed, not by David but by the silence, by the nights spent lying next to a man who hadn't touched me in months, by the years of dinners eaten in silence, of birthdays forgotten, of tears wiped alone in a bathroom while the world kept turning. But other times, I know better. I know no one forced me. No one dragged me into that moment. I walked there on my own 2 feet, eyes wide open. And still I'm not sure where the line was, if it was crossed, or if by the time we stood in that room, the line had already vanished. Perhaps it faded long ago, when I stopped feeling seen. When my marriage became a calendar of silence. When I began measuring my worth by how invisible I could become without anyone noticing. I haven't told a soul. Not a friend, not a therapist, not even the page, not really. I still write in riddles, still keep the truth behind metaphors because stating it plainly feels too final, too bare. But every time I bake that banana loaf, every time the scent of cinnamon and warm sugar fills the house, I see his eyes again. The way he looked at me that night, not with desire, not with confusion, but with something deeper, something like longing, something that mirrored my own. And that's the part I can't forget. Not the kiss, not the robe, not even the shame, but that look. That 1 second when someone saw me so clearly, it made me question everything I thought I was, and everything I was trying so hard to pretend I wasn't. Have you ever stood in a moment that blurred every boundary you thought you believed in? Have you ever reached for something not because it was forbidden, but because it was the only thing that made you feel real again? I ask myself that every day. Was I wrong for craving what my marriage no longer provided? Or was I just human? Is there ever a clean way to hunger? Is there ever a safe way to feel alive again when you've been numb for so long?